You're listening to an Ono Media podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Into the Dark podcast. I'm your host, Payton Moreland. I'm so glad you are here. If you are watching on YouTube, you obviously know that I am in a different set. If you're listening on audio, I might even sound a little different. That is because I am actually recording on my mom's set in Idaho. If you don't know, my mom has a true crime news podcast called Rising Crime that is also with our network, Ono Media. And I happen to be in Idaho this week because I am choreographing for a cheer team with my sister, hence why I have to record Into the Dark here. But either way, I am so happy to be here and I'm so happy you are listening. So yeah, like I just said, for my 10 seconds, I have been choreographing. I hung out with my sister. It has actually been so fun. If you didn't know, I actually used to dance all growing up and then I danced through college. That was how I paid for college, was on scholarship for the dance team. I competed. I won a couple national titles. I'm not trying to, toot my own horn or anything. It's just that I have this whole other life. I feel like was so far, forever ago, but also was my entire life. My entire life growing up was dance. Now I just true crime podcast. It's weird. It's good, but I'm having a lot of fun. That being said, I just want to jump straight into today's case. Now, today I am covering another UFO sighting, but there's something very cool that sets this case apart from others like it. A lot of the time when you hear about people spotting possible visitors from outer space, the claims are hard to verify. They involve strange objects in remote areas, a small number of witnesses, and they usually don't have any recording equipment on them. If someone does manage to take a picture, it's often blurry or looks potentially photoshopped. And this is actually why I have a hard time believing in Bigfoot, because nowadays with everyone having a camera on them, how has no one actually caught a good picture? I don't believe it. All the cameras, all of the phones out there, and people are still seeing Bigfoot, but no one can take a picture of him. That might be a tinfoil tale I don't believe in. But because of this means that people who claim to see UFOs have nothing to show for it usually. No proof and nobody to back them up and confirm what they've seen. But on November 7th, 2006, a strange flying saucer in the sky did appear. And it was on one of the most closely monitored places on Earth, the O'Hare Airport in Chicago. Not only on this day did dozens of people see this unidentified flying object, but no one has ever been able to explain away this sighting. To this day, there's no other credible explanation except that this really was a UFO that multiple people saw. Now, before I start this story, it is worth establishing a few facts about Chicago O'Hare. In early 2006, it was the busiest airport in the entire United States. That year, over 477,000 flights either took off or landed at this airport. If you break that number down, it meant a flight landed there roughly every 30 seconds. So it was the sort of place where workers were always busy and keeping their eyes on a lot of different things. And at about 4:30 p.m. on the 7th, back in 2006, one airport worker was standing on the tarmac near an airplane. He was helping to guide it somewhere. And this man's name has not been made public, but for simplicity, I'm going to call him James. Anyway, the sun was setting and the plane was safely on the ground, but for some reason, James looks straight up and he saw something hovering above him in the sky. Now, it was hard for James to tell how high up it was. All he knew for sure was that it was below the lowest clouds. And weather records from that day said the cloud layer was about 1,900 feet off the ground. So imagine two Eiffel Towers stacked on top of one another. Now, if you were on the ground and looking at the top of the second Eiffel Tower, that is how far away this floating object was. The thing looks like a flying disc or a frisbee, but it's not moving around or coming in for landing. It is just sitting still in midair. Now, James couldn't hear any engines or any other sounds, and he didn't see any lights on the object. It was just this strange flying saucer, and it was directly above his head. James didn't know how to make any sense of it. So he radioed ground control to describe what he was seeing and ask if anyone knew what it is. I mean, this is his job, right? We're at an airport. A random object can't just be floating in the sky. Not only is that almost not possible, it seems, but number two, that is dangerous. So he lets other people know. And while he's waiting for an answer, he also hopped on the radio with the cockpit crew in the airplane that he was working with. And James was like, hey, are you seeing this thing? Well, the people hadn't yet, but the crew looks out their windows and up, and they radio back to James and they say, yeah, we can see that disc floating in the air, and we have no idea what it is. Now, around this same time at the airport, a mechanic was working near their gate, and he also saw the unidentified craft. He later described the sighting to a reporter saying, quote, I tend to be scientific by nature, and I don't understand why aliens would hover over a busy airport. But I know that what I saw and what a lot of other people saw that day stood out very clearly, and it definitely was not an Earth aircraft. So basically what I'm trying to get at is that eyewitness after eyewitness kept seeing this thing in the sky that day, and many of them reached out to ground control. Now, for those who don't know, ground control employees are supposed to direct all of the traffic and the operations at an airport. They tell airplanes when it's safe to land or take off. They send employees to handle special tasks, and they keep everything running on schedule. So ground control workers basically need to know everything that's going on at all times. They're always checking radar screens and looking out the windows so nothing catches them by surprise. Now, some of their workers actually sit in a very high tower with a view of the entire airport around them, just so they can keep tabs on all the activity. All to say, if anyone was going to be able to figure out what was flying in the air, it would probably have been one of them. So there is this control tower, okay? But at this time, everyone asks ground control, can you see this? What is it? What is that in the sky? Multiple people are seeing it. And ground control is like, we can't see it. Now, based on what some witnesses said, it seemed like the saucer was hovering right in the control tower's blind spot. It was in the one and only place where the workers couldn't see it. Now, interestingly enough, though, the employees in ground control checked their radar equipment and other monitors after they couldn't visually see it. And all of the machinery also said nothing was there. So a bunch of workers are calling other workers who should know what's in the sky because they're the closest to it. And they're like, hey, we can see this thing. What is it? And ground control doesn't know what it is. They don't really know what to make of this. They thought maybe the craft had some kind of advanced stealth technology, or maybe the skies were empty and everyone was just seeing an optical illusion. They had no evidence to suggest that the saucer in the sky was real. And that's what ground control kept saying. Every time someone called them to report this same vessel, the workers in there said, sorry, there's nothing there. We can't see anything on radar. We can't see it, so you must be mistaken. But so far as everyone else was concerned, this thing was highly visible and eyewitnesses were now piling up. More and more people were looking at the skies and seeing something that they couldn't explain at this airport. Now, one gate worker was in his office when the sighting began. There were no windows in his office, so obviously he couldn't see anything, but he could hear a lot of chatter on the radio. People were calling one another to say that they had seen a hovering aircraft and to check who else had spotted it. So this officer actually runs out onto the concourse and looks up, and he wasn't actually expecting to see an alien. His fear was that a weather balloon had drifted into the airspace. It could pose a danger to airplanes. But instead, he peered through the huge windows and skylights, and he sees the flying saucer. And he's now too stunned to even know what to think. In fact, this guy turned to a coworker who was in the area at the same time, and he's like, dude, look at this thing in the sky. It's just floating there. What is it? And the coworker said, I'll just shrug it off. It's probably just a large bird. And he walked away. Now, another employee had a brief crisis of faith after they saw the craft. I don't know much about them because they haven't come forward to tell their story publicly, but they did complain to some coworkers that they were struggling. Their religious beliefs included the idea that Earth is the only planet with life on it. Except that day, when they saw the flying saucer in the sky, they couldn't deny that it didn't look like it came from Earth. So now, because of this thing that they actually saw, they're having to reevaluate everything they thought they'd known about God and their religion. It's safe to say that a lot of people were very upset and stunned by what they were seeing that day. This wasn't a practical joke or a trick of the light. It was very real and very worrisome and meaningful to a lot of people at the airport. In fact, it was almost unthinkable that anyone would have faked the sighting as a prank. Airport work is serious business and the sort of place where one little mistake could be life-threatening. So as a general rule, the people at O'Hare didn't joke around or play tricks on each other. So when person after person came forward to say, hey, we're seeing this flying saucer, that was something to take seriously. And on top of that, the witnesses were pretty consistent overall. Almost everyone who saw the craft that day said it was a shiny, gray, disc-shaped object. It didn't have any audible engines or any lights on it, and it wasn't going anywhere. It was just hovering midair. And they also all agreed that the thing was flying below the clouds, which again means it's about 1,900 feet away. That said, there were a few small inconsistencies from one telling to the next. For example, some people thought the disc was spinning, while others thought it was just hovering. And some people thought the ship was pretty small, maybe just 6 feet across. Definitely too small for there to be any passengers on board, unless they were also tiny. But others described it as being maybe 24 feet in diameter. That would make it a little bigger than a 15-passenger van, a little smaller than a school bus. So that would definitely be big enough to have some kind of human-like creature aboard. Now, inconsistencies aside, overall, it sounded like everyone was roughly saying the same thing. They had all seen the same gray flying saucer at the same time in the same place, and these reports weren't limited to just the employees that day. The next story comes from a woman whose identity has not been released to the public, but to keep things simple, I'm going to call her Lisa. So on the 7th at around 4:40 p.m., Lisa was on her way to the airport with a friend who I'm going to call Penny, and they were there to pick up someone else who was flying in that day. Now, Lisa hadn't pulled in or parked yet, but she was just right outside the airport when she sees the craft in the sky. She had no idea what she was looking at. All she could tell was that its top seemed to be shiny or reflective, and the bottom was a dull gray. Beyond that, she couldn't determine anything else about it. She wasn't even sure if it looked like it was made of metal or ceramic. But Lisa did know that it wasn't safe to drive while she was this distracted. To be fair, she wasn't going very fast or moving much at all. In fact, it was rush hour. She was sitting in gridlock. She could see other people in other cars pull out their phones, because again, this is 2006, to record the craft or try to take pictures. But she didn't want to do the same thing. She wanted to look at the vessel in a safe way. So even though her curiosity was eating at her, Lisa drove straight to the nearest parking lot, found a spot. It wasn't at the airport, but it did have a pretty good view of the sky. And while she was circling in the garage, she lost sight of the disc for a few moments. But once she was parked and able to get out of her car, it wasn't hard to find the object again. There was a huge crowd gathered on the sidewalk, everyone staring straight up. One clump of about 7 people had broken off from the others, and one of those 7 people, a man, was trying to capture a photo of what they were seeing. But it was too dark and it was too far away. All of his shots were turning out blurry. In fact, Lisa was actually having a hard time seeing it with just her bare eyes. In her mind, it almost seemed like the ship had some kind of camouflage. It kept changing colors, blending in with the sky and the clouds. Or maybe, since the other witnesses said the thing was shiny, Lisa was actually seeing the sky reflected off of its surface. And there's one other thing I need to mention about Lisa, okay? Her father was a member of the military. So growing up, she had spent a lot of time on or near different bases, and she'd seen a ton of different aircraft taking off and landing. This included some experimental planes that the general public didn't really know about. When Lisa watched this thing, though, it didn't look like any kind of vehicle she'd ever seen before. Like so many of the other witnesses, Lisa believed she was watching an alien visitor, that this thing in the sky had not come from Earth. Which, okay, I know this sounds like a huge conclusion to come to, but it's worth keeping in mind that this sighting wasn't quick or brief and only viewed by a few people. Lisa got a really good look at this thing. In total, it was visible in the sky for about 5 minutes. At least that's according to most witnesses. Lisa said she stood and watched it for like 13 to 14 minutes. I don't know if that means she spotted it before anyone else or just spent longer looking for it in the sky, or if someone made a mistake when estimating how long the ship stayed around for. The point is that eventually, as everyone's watching, the flying disc shot straight upward, just blasting into the sky. Eyewitnesses were actually impressed with how quickly it ascended. They had never seen anything else, not even an airplane, fly up that fast. The group who were standing with Lisa actually gasped in surprise when they saw it, like multiple people. And Lisa felt a tingly sensation on her skin, like there was electricity in the air. While the vessel was departing, it zipped through a cloud with so much force that it actually left an opening in the cloud in its wake. One witness described the situation like this, quote, "It was like somebody punched a hole in the sky. The hole was visible for a while after that, long after the flying ship was gone, meaning there were some people who hadn't seen the unidentified object, but were able to spot the opening it had left behind. It was just one more piece of evidence that everyone was seeing something real. This wasn't imaginary. This wasn't just one person. I mean, it really sounds like there are a ton of credible witnesses for this UFO sighting. It would have been very difficult for anyone to deny that this was a real sighting of an actual alien spaceship. But like everything, that's exactly what happened. See, in the weeks and months after the sighting, the eyewitnesses at the airport kept following up with their bosses and officials at the airport. They were asking for answers. Some of them even reached out to groups like the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA. That's the organization that oversees airports, planes, and everything else in the industry. So these people kept asking, has anyone figured out what we saw? Was that a flying saucer? They're like, it really looked like an alien spaceship. Is there any explanation? Well, consistently, anytime anyone asked about the incident, the authorities just said the same thing. They said they had no records of any sighting on November 7th. They said they never heard anything about it. Nobody had filed any reports. And no one had investigated because there was nothing to investigate. This was in spite of the fact that approximately 12 people formally reported the sighting to professionals. That's not counting those who'd seen the craft but failed to file any paperwork after. Or people like Lisa, who didn't work for the airport, didn't need to go to the proper authorities to file. So to summarize, all of these witnesses had reported what they'd seen, but the officials at the airport and with the FAA were saying, we don't know anything about this. There's no record of any UFOs at O'Hare. It was a confusing answer. You might be thinking, okay, well, maybe some people filed reports and they didn't go through for some reason. Paperwork might have gotten lost on accident. That's very unlikely for a few reasons. First, like I said, approximately 12 separate people had filed reports. Seemed too unlikely that dozen files would just happen to go missing on accident. But also, even without those reports, the airport should have other evidence of the UFO. If you remember, the radio had been blowing up with chatter that day of people seeing it. And it's routine for every radio call to be recorded and saved. So the O'Hare investigators should have had tapes of all of these conversations, even if nobody had ever reported anything unusual. One of the first radio calls had come from a woman who worked with United Airlines. She'd called a ground control employee named Dave. She identified herself as Sue. Then she asked the controllers, quote, "Hey, did you see a flying disc out by gate C-17?
Tower, this is Dave.
Hey, did you see a flying disc out by C-17?
Don't even start, Sue.
No,
You're seeing flying discs.
well, that's what the pilot and the ramp guys are telling us. The C-17, they saw some flying disc above it. We can't see
Come
above us.
on,
You
Sue.
didn't see it, right?
You guys been celebrating the holidays or anything, or what? You having a Christmas party today?
She and Dave share a chuckle. It's a huge joke. Dave confirms, I haven't seen anything, Sue. And if I did, I wouldn't admit to it. In a different call, a control tower operator asked another staffer, hey, did you see anything above United's concourse? They actually, believe it or not, called us and said they might be seeing a flying disc.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, look out your window. Do you see anything above United's concourse? They actually, believe it or not, they called us and said somebody observed a flying disc about 1,000 feet above the gate Charlie 17. Do you see anything over there?
Oh, we saw it a half hour ago.
Literally right there on tape, they acknowledged that multiple employees had seen this saucer. Then, when the ground control employee asked who exactly had spotted it, the other man on the radio is like, a bunch of us. On top of that, there were pilots who had been rerouted away from gate C-17, which was very near the area where the saucer was supposedly hovering. These pilots hadn't seen the flying craft for themselves, but ground control had told them that they needed to land or take off from a different gate because of an unidentified object in the airspace. So hypothetically, okay, even if none of the witnesses had formally filed a report with their supervisors or the FAA, which we know that they did, there still should have been a ton of documentation and records related to those sightings and the reroutings. And just from a safety perspective, you cannot have a strange unidentified object flying over major airports. Even if it's just a weather balloon or something like that, somebody has to figure out where it had come from and make sure that it didn't come back. Airport policy said that there should have been some kind of investigation. But here the officials were saying they had no idea what everyone was talking about. They weren't going to look any deeper into it, which meant the airport employees were frustrated. And honestly, that's putting it mildly after this. They felt like their testimony was being ignored and like their bosses were gaslighting them. Frankly, they think the officials are lying. And all of these eyewitnesses wanted the truth to go on the record. They wanted people to know, no, we really did see something this day, no matter how many people are trying to cover it up. So once it became clear that they weren't going to accomplish anything by going through the proper channels, they began reaching out to other people. This included individuals who had nothing to do with the airport or aviation. One eyewitness, an O'Hare-based manager who refused to share their real name, wrote a description of what they'd seen and submitted it to a UFO organization. It was a brief story about how they were working in the airport, looked out the window, saw the object. The organization decided to publish the story on their website. It was the first public leak about what had happened at this airport. And admittedly, it didn't cause much of a stir. A bunch of people don't believe in UFOs. They don't find anonymous accounts on the internet particularly credible. But other witnesses contacted reporters and newspapers hoping someone would write a story. A bunch of them ended up talking to John Hilkovich, who was a journalist with the Chicago Tribune.
Every major country, it seems, people have written in, both those who claims they've spotted UFOs during their life, as well as serious researchers. I mean, just the last 2 days, this is my email, and these are the serious emails. The ones from kooks who said they were brought aboard alien spacecraft, I put in a circular file. So it's just a story that has legs, and people are fascinated by the thought, and I think there's some belief that there are advanced life forms that are visiting us here on a regular basis.
And on New Year's Day in 2007, he published an article with the title, "In the Sky, a Bird, a Plane, a UFO?" It was a very detailed account of the sightings that had happened nearly 2 months earlier in the previous November. Now, this story was very important because the Chicago Tribune is a well-respected newspaper. They're not a tabloid. They don't report on things unless they are sure the information they are giving is accurate. So this article gave a lot of these eyewitnesses the validation they'd been looking for. It said, you did experience something real. A lot of people also experienced it, and there are people out there who believe you. But here's where this story gets really interesting. When he was writing the article, John reached out to O'Hare officials to ask, hey, do you have any records? What happened? What's your take? What is the official word? And their answer was the same thing they had been telling employees. They claimed they didn't have any records of a UFO sighting. There was nothing to say, except after this article got published, some people filed freedom of information requests on the airport's records. They wanted to see if there was any documentation that the officials weren't sharing. and these requests would have required the airport to release any files they had that weren't classified or confidential. The Freedom of Information Act releases showed that not only had the officials received all 12 of those UFO reports, so they lied to their own employees, they had already investigated them, according to their files as well. So they were saying nobody reported an unidentified object. They hadn't heard about it, but in the meanwhile, they had copies of the papers that they claimed didn't exist, and they were already looked into. The investigation had begun the day after the sighting on November 8th, and within the next 2 days, they had abruptly closed the case without solving it. Now, I want to be clear. The released materials didn't have any answers in them. No sign that anyone ever tried to identify the flying object before shutting the investigation down. Almost like they didn't want to learn the truth, or maybe they were afraid what they'd find. Either way, this release put the officials in an uncomfortable position. They couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened at their airport on November 7th, not when it was obvious that they'd secretly launched an investigation and then lied about it. They had to change their tactics. So once their records were released to the public, they said they knew what those flying discs were and they were not alien ships. Instead, they come forward now with an official statement saying the UFOs had been a trick of the light. Now, remember I told you November 7th, 2006 was a cloudy day. A lot of airplanes and other vehicles were driving around the tarmac with their lights on. Those lights must have been reflecting off the clouds and making it look like a ship was hovering in the air. And as for the cloud that got a hole in it, they agreed, yeah, a flying object probably did create that opening, but they said it was just from an ordinary airplane taking off. Nothing supernatural, nothing to do with aliens. In fact, they said that was the real reason why they hadn't done more of an investigation. It was also why they hadn't answered any of the requests for information. According to the officials, the answer was so boring and obvious it wasn't a good use of anyone's time to discuss it any further. This is literally what they said to people when people were like, hey, why are you lying? Now, needless to say, a lot of people had a hard time accepting this official finding because it's worth remembering that most of the eyewitnesses are airport employees. They were at O'Hare every single day, watching the skies and working with airplanes and pilots. They knew what it looked like when lights bounced off the clouds, and they weren't going to confuse an optical illusion with a UFO, especially because all of their descriptions are pretty consistent. A reflected beam of light doesn't look like a shiny gray disc, but that's what everyone said they had seen, a hovering, perfectly circular saucer. It's also worth noting that it is technically possible for airplanes to tear holes in clouds, just like what the officials said, except again, the employees at O'Hare were used to this. They knew what those holes looked like, and they knew that the opening from November 7th was something different. Finally, we should remember that when the vessel flew away, it was going faster than any known airplane. Some people have theorized that it had to have been some kind of advanced engine that just hasn't been invented yet on Earth. So again, this isn't a normal airplane taking off. Dozens of people wouldn't have filed official reports seeking an explanation for an ordinary commonplace phenomena. So the fact that so many staffers and travelers were so confused and so moved, that should be evident on its own that something very strange did happen that day. Of course, not everyone agrees with that conclusion. I'm sad to report this, but you see it often in UFO stories. The accounts about the O'Hare unidentified flying object hit the public, and then pranksters and practical jokers swooped in. A bunch of people went online claiming that they'd been at the airport that day, they'd seen the craft, they'd taken photos of it. But when the people posted the pictures, every single one of them was obviously photoshopped. They were all hoaxes. This was enough for some people to assume that the entire situation was a fraud, which isn't how things are supposed to work. Just because one person lies or fakes a photo doesn't mean everyone else that was there and saw it with their own eyes is lying as well. So this is just enough to muddy the waters. It made it much harder for journalists and everyone else to sort through what was real and what wasn't. I'll also note that to this day, nobody has shared a credible photo of the O'Hare UFO. Some skeptics pointed to that and said the sighting had to be a hoax. Their thinking was that if dozens of people had seen this thing, someone should have at least snapped a picture. In the meanwhile, true believers say there's a good reason nobody has a picture. It was high up in the air at sunset when the lighting wasn't great, and while a bunch of witnesses tried to capture it on film, the circumstances just weren't good for a photo. Either way, so far as the official story goes, that's where things end. The officials at O'Hare never changed their stance. To this day, they still say the UFO sightings on November 7th, 2006 were a trick of the light and normal weather patterns. These authorities also insist they're not opening a new investigation because according to them, there's still no reason to look into this event. This is in spite of the fact that true believers think aliens were visiting the airport that day. Those are two very different interpretations of events, and the two sides have never been able to come to any kind of agreement. It's actually possible we'll never know the truth, but in the meanwhile, we can keep researching and trying to understand this story, and we can also keep our eyes on the sky. It is always so shocking to me when multiple, like more than 12 official employees come forward to say they have seen something, and in history, it just doesn't exist. And that is the case of the O'Hare UFO. Thank you guys so much for listening today. I hope you kind of loved this spooky one. I think next week we are jumping right back into true crime, so I'll see you then. Goodbye.